Starting and scaling a B2B podcast is really, really hard. And if I could go back in time and give myself 5 brutally honest truths before launching this podcast, these would be them. Okay, so lesson number 1 that I feel like I've learned the hard way is that getting started is really the hardest part of all of this process. When I think about when we launched this podcast and even Websites Decoded, our other podcast, there was no fancy studio like I'm sat in now. We had no great mics, we had no great cameras. We literally just started the podcast with our laptops, with our webcam, our built-in webcams, our built-in mics. We streamed on LinkedIn Live to grow a bit of an initial audience, to nail down ourselves for that actual date and time. And it really wasn't polished. And you know what? It was really nerve-wracking as well. I recently just went to watch back episode 1 of Demand Decoded, and my God, I think I made it to about the 10-minute mark, and I was cringing so much I just couldn't finish it. So please don't go back and listen to episode 1. It was a horrible thing to look back at, but you grow as you do podcasting, and you learn kind of what works, your kind of conversational style, what you enjoy to talk about, how you bounce off of other people, how to ask questions meaningfully, how to add to a conversation, how to know when not to talk, to be honest. But I think the message to get across here in that, getting started is the hardest part, is that you don't need all of the fancy equipment. You don't need highly polished production in order to have a podcast that resonates with your audience. What you actually need is a good, unique point of view. You need to understand your buyers, and you need to be able to educate them in a way that's compelling enough that they learn, they want to come back, and they enjoy consuming your content. That's ultimately the goal of a podcast, to educate and have return listeners that trust you and may or may not want to buy from you in the future. But that is the overall goal that you're going for when it comes to getting started. So I think one thing, and this probably goes throughout all of B2B marketing, is that actually launching fast and learning fast is the best way to be, especially right now as everything is accelerated through AI. Having thoughts and technological excuses hold you back is a really dangerous place to be in, because you end up never doing anything whilst everybody else who's accelerating all of their activity, especially through AI, are just learning and iterating fast and time again. So yes, getting started is hard. Being kind of vulnerable to people calling you out and disagreeing with you, and even just listening to yourself back is, a hard thing to do at first. And it's uncomfortable, but actually you just begin to normalize the discomfort. And almost everybody that starts a podcast, if you just scroll all the way back to episode 1, you will just see such a drastic difference from then to where they are now. And, when I think about the most successful podcasts, they've done hundreds of episodes. Most of them are 200 plus, many are 400-500 plus actually. And the amount of learnings in that time are unbelievable. Getting started is definitely the hardest part, but obviously, we don't get to episode 68 like we are here. You don't get to episode 200, 300 without starting episode 1. So that is the important thing to remember. This podcast is brought to you by Blend. We're a B2B website and demand generation agency. We work with ambitious businesses just like yours to create and execute effective demand generation strategies that drive pipeline for your business. We also recognize that your website is the most important asset you have in marketing. So we specialize in building scalable websites on HubSpot that convert the demand that you've created. If you want to find out more about our services and see real results that we've generated for businesses, visit blendb2b.com. One thing that really helped me sell in the idea of a podcast, and has helped a lot of people sell in the idea of a podcast, is not framing it as the podcast itself. Yes, the podcast itself will give you a great source of long form content, but it's about everything else that the podcast brings. We spoke maybe on the last episode, the episode before, even with Kyle Denhoff, about this new B2B content marketing playbook, which is all about starting with a long form piece of content that has a unique point of view, that shares your opinion with the market, educates them in this long form way, which is the seed to all the other content that you can then create. And it's not a huge lift to then repurpose that into a podcast, but where you'll get the most value, where you'll get the most engagement, the most impressions, the most clicks, is actually the repurposed content that you get out the back of that. So even if you sell in the podcast first as a way to purely produce content at scale and across multimedia and multi-channel, then that will get you started, and that will kind of sell it into the business and just give you a jumping off point to then expand the podcast from and see the value directly from the podcast itself. Another really hard challenge with a lot of podcasts, and B2B podcasts in particular, especially with smaller marketing teams and lean budgets, is that you'll typically have the one person, whether that be a marketing manager, content marketing manager, one person that might do absolutely everything. And that's where I was. All of the ideation, the scheduling, recording, editing, publishing, clipping, writing, producing, behind the scenes, setup, all of this is a lot for one person to handle. And what you kind of miss out on here is the fun of podcasting, which is actually getting behind the mic and, you know, bouncing off of somebody, throwing ideas around, having discussion, having a laugh at some points. And it removes the element of it feeling like work and like a job. Whereas as soon as you start to layer in everything else you need to think about, the fun starts to be stripped out. That's before we even get into the actual like production quality advantages of not doing it yourself. That you get because, you know, you don't have to control the audio levels, you don't have to control the focus on the cameras, you don't have to do white balancing on editing and remove certain sounds and distractions that happen during the podcast. You know, you don't need to do all of that. And one thing that's really helped us in this podcast and our other podcasts as well is having somebody internally who can help maximize the output that we're able to deliver. You know, when I can dedicate my time to simply producing, well, sitting behind the mic and talking about things that I've learned in the market from marketers I've spoken to, from our customers, from our strategy team and other teams, we can absolutely double, triple, quadruple the output in some cases, and it enables me to have a clearer vision on where I want the podcast to go, what I want us to talk about, and yeah, just be able to absolutely nail the output and have more consistent output too, because, you know, I'm not being pulled in too many directions. On that point as well, just being creative and having the energy for ideation and discussion actually on a podcast is a finite resource, and you really need to protect that in whatever way you can. So that's why I think being able to outsource some of your production is extremely valuable. Of course, you need to get to a position in order to do that, which I'll speak about in a sec, but just being able to protect that resource is a really important thing to do. And, you know, I haven't even spoken about just the different actual skills required in content creation, as I'm doing now, just talking, and the actual production of content. They are different skills and require different skill sets. The more I sit behind a mic and learn how to, you know, explain my thoughts and come across the right way, have meaningful discussions, understand, you know, how to listen deeply too, like that is a skill to craft and hone in on itself. The same way that learning how to edit a podcast trailer, how to, you know, stitch certain things together and transition from one thing to another are all very important skills, but are very different skills. And being able to outsource one part of that enables me to actually deliver my thoughts and the kind of educational content we want to in a much better way. It's really, really important to understand when to get to this scale, though, and when to outsource your production, because like I spoke about at the start, really the best way to get started is just on your own. Fire up whatever equipment you have, edit it yourself if you absolutely have to. Start with episode 1 so you can get to episode 100. That's the most important thing. But it's also really important to know when you actually need to scale and get a producer in-house or outsource that. And there are a few things to think about here. So the first thing that I saw was that I was becoming the bottleneck in creating our content. I was ending up delaying releases, causing us to skip episodes altogether, going a few weeks, even up to a month before actually posting another episode, just because there was so much friction in my day-to-day job and I didn't have the time to actually sit down, record and edit and do all of the post-production required in a podcast. So that was a huge warning sign. Like, if we want to actually continue this podcast and scale it, and we were already seeing the value, which I'll speak about in a moment. But if we want to continue on this and actually scale it up, we're gonna need to remove the bottleneck, which is me. The next thing to consider is the actual quality of the output. Obviously, like I spoke about, having a content creator and a content producer require different skill sets. And if you feel like your output doesn't match the input, so your creative content advice is really, really great and you've got a good message that resonates with the market, but your post-production doesn't match up with that, a producer can obviously elevate that show and polish it up for you. So, that kind of leans into caring more so about the output and having it matched up with you. And I think the important point to remember and to know here is really when to start doing all of this, even if you feel quite burnt out, you feel like you are the bottleneck, the content quality isn't necessarily that good, and you're considering outsourcing the production or getting somebody in-house to do it. I think it's still important to have seen value from the podcast and be able to prove value, because ultimately you're going to need to justify this decision to outsource it or take budget from somewhere else and use it to outsource the production. So you need to be able to prove value from the podcast, first of all. And that comes from a few different ways. So you've got things like self-reported attribution, which, if you're doing podcasting right and you're driving demand through podcasting, you're educating the market in the right way and building affinity with your brand, soon enough, your self-reported attribution will eventually show people finding you and hearing about you through your podcast. The other thing to consider are the qualitative things that you're hearing in the business. And these might come from sales, like sales conversations that you might be able to use a tool like Gong to actually analyze and track. Are people mentioning the podcast? Have they listened to your content? Did they find you on LinkedIn, where your podcast content came from? Another thing to consider is like retention rates through customers that listen to your podcast. Customers that are fully aligned with the content that you create and the ethos and approach that you take to whatever market that you're in, they're fully aligned with you, will typically be retained better. But your data might show that, can you pinpoint the customers that interact with your content, that turn up on your live shows that you turn into podcasts afterwards? And do they retain better? Do they expand better? All of these things will be signals to tell you when you're ready to scale up. And, you want a few of those signals in place. You want to be seeing positive signs of success. Those even early indicators, like customers interacting and just knowing that your content is resonating with the right people, and that if you just put a bit more effort into it and remove potentially the bottleneck from that outsourced production, you might be able to scale growth even faster. The third point I've got is being YouTube first, podcast second. And I think I was quite naive, actually, when we started Demand Decoded, to think that podcast listeners would just find us through Spotify or Apple. But that really didn't happen, to be honest. And it's taken all of this time. We're probably pushing 18 months, maybe even like 2 years. I think more 18 months of doing this podcast. And I've learned the hard way that people just won't find us through Spotify or Apple, no matter how much people tell you that you need to do, podcast title SEO, which can help a little bit, but the majority of your audience aren't going to find you through that. They're going to be finding you through things like social, maybe even like your email newsletter. But the realization for me was when we've recently started trying on YouTube. I know that sounds, funny, like why would you be even uploading on YouTube without trying? But that was just another channel to place our content on, which could be linked to and embedded from other places. But actually, when you start trying on YouTube and you upload your first few shorts, you upload that first thumbnail that you've really kind of crafted quite carefully, you've lent into YouTube SEO, and you've got something like vidIQ to find keyword volumes on YouTube, and all of a sudden you're starting to see more comments, more engagement, more views on your videos. And really, like, this has been such an eye-opener to me that YouTube is absolutely the place to start a podcast. It's not just a distribution platform, it's a search and discovery engine that will drive most of your new your new listeners to your podcast. I mean, now I think about it, it's actually quite obvious, because in B2B, people will often search for things to learn. They will search for topics that they don't quite understand, they need to educate themselves on further, and they will do that in channels like search and like YouTube. They won't search for that in a podcast typically. So getting those new listeners is much, much easier through a channel like YouTube than if you weren't actually trying to actually focus on YouTube itself. So yeah, now we are totally shifting our thinking to be YouTube first, and this aligns with kind of what we're doing with the channels, what we're trying out in terms of like visual framing, transitions, where we're actually placing content in the video, trying to ramp up retention rate, like being a huge one for the Google algorithm, title formatting, descriptions, like chapters. All of these considerations we're now putting into YouTube, because I absolutely see it as the biggest growth lever we have for the podcast. And I think, if I could go back 18 months and start the podcast again, I wouldn't even care. Like, I would reverse my thinking from thinking more about the audio consumption, which is still important. Thank you to everybody who listens to this, of course. But actually, the video consumption is more important for initial discovery. Like, audio is still probably the place, or a key place, to retain listeners and get repeat listeners back to the podcast, coming, every single week, getting that notification on their phone. But YouTube is equally important for that, and also has the added benefit of that discoverability, which is just absolutely unmatched when it comes to other podcast players. So yeah, I would say that was a mistake, but 68 episodes in now, shifting our thinking. But yeah, if you're thinking about starting a podcast, think YouTube first. Lesson 4 is that podcast ROI is definitely real, but it's just not immediate. There is a myth out there, I would say, that you can't measure the impact of a podcast. And you can't, to some degree. You can't measure the impact in comparison to a performance marketing campaign when you're running Google ads and you're measuring immediate conversions on your landing page. It doesn't work like that. It's a brand activity. It's a non-trackable dark place where you distribute content. And if somebody sees your podcast 100 times, you might never know that unless they convert on your website and tell you, or they tell you another way. You just won't know. But to say that you just blanket statement can't measure the impact of a podcast is just absolutely not true. You just need to know where to look. And I've already mentioned these places, but self-reported attribution will be a key way to know if your podcast for your business is actually driving conversions on your website and like building demand for actually what you offer and converting in that way on your website ultimately. And even this won't be immediate. It will take time to even grow your audience and actually build trust, build affinity, and have people trust you enough and understand that you are the go-to place for this advice and for this service or this product, and then go to your website and tell you that they heard about you through your podcast. That will still take time as you grow up your listenership, but it will come if you're doing B2B podcasting effectively. And the other thing, like I spoke about before, was those qualitative insights. So through sales conversations, maybe you have a call recording software. Can you measure how many times people are referencing your content? It might be the content that's created from your podcast. It might not be the podcast itself. It might be that somebody just says they listened to you on YouTube. It might not appear in any attribution, but it might come out in a sales conversation, for example, or a customer success conversation from existing customers. Then can you link all of those things together to understand that actually the people who reference that they consumed our content either convert at a much higher rate or they're retained and expanded at a much higher rate. And then you soon start to build up this picture of the impact of your content and your podcast, the content that's created from your podcast. The people that consume it are a better fit for the business, and they are, they offer more lifetime value, essentially, which is the commercial metrics that the people who you're kind of trying to justify the time investment for this podcast to actually matter. Lesson 5, which I'm even guilty of as I say it for this episode, which is quite funny, is that preparation equals quality. And there is this correlation, for me at least, which I've found between prep time and the quality of an episode. And funnily enough, we recorded a podcast earlier, which I prepared for quite deeply. I had half an hour of focused prep, which really, really helps me just get in the zone before a podcast. And I will try and do it immediately before that episode, sometimes the night before, so I can sleep on it, but I'll always give myself some focus time before that episode if I can. And I find that if I do have that focused prep time, the quality of the episode and my ability to string thoughts together and get ideas across, verbally, is much, much stronger. So you'll be able to tell, probably, because I haven't prepared as much for this episode, that if you go back to the last episode, am I able to convey thoughts as well as I am in this episode? I don't know. I don't feel as prepared, perhaps, for this one, because I maybe had 15 minutes of prep rather than, half an hour, even more than that, perhaps. And I just think that everybody who podcasts, I know some people are really, really great at just winging it and just being able to ad lib and go with the flow. But I think for most podcasters, simple preparation will always outperform simply just winging it. And this is where AI can massively help you, because now all I do is just think about the topic that we're going to cover, which is usually prepared weeks in advance, within a spreadsheet, and it's put in the calendar, probably a month, if not 3 weeks in advance. And I understand that topic and I understand the points that I want to get across. So all I do is just bullet points, some notes, run that into AI to have it kind of translate all of those ideas into a better structure to then run through. And then all of a sudden, I have a more structured approach to actually recording the podcast itself, and it just enables me to kind of convey my thoughts a bit better, come up with some sort of structure to the podcast, and stay organized as I'm talking and throughout the entire episode. I think there's still definitely room to be there's still room to be spontaneous, but you need that structure to make sure you're conveying the thoughts that you initially wanted to in that episode anyway. And I think it kind of depends on your style of podcast as well. So if I was interviewing somebody, the prep would be very different to a solo episode. So this solo episode, for example, I already had these 5 things determined in a LinkedIn post that I already posted. I just needed to kind of expand on these thoughts a little bit within the episode itself, but I kind of already had that in my mind. If I was interviewing an external guest, the prep would be very different. I'd want to look more into their profile, understand what they do. I might have a call with some guests before they come on and enable that prep as well, and maybe feed the transcript from our prep call into AI to get our discussion points out, and probably think and structure it in a more refined way than a solo episode, which in some ways is more templated, because you can't have spontaneous thoughts just appear on your own very often. You know, sometimes my mind does wander, but it will never give me a whole new talking point, perhaps. Like, you know, if you were just interviewing somebody completely new, the conversation does flow and goes wherever it needs to, and it can spark new ideas. So yeah, it's important to kind of find the right rhythm for you depending on your podcast, but I definitely find that preparation does decide the outcome and the quality that you get from your podcast. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there. This was a bit of a different episode, but one that I've been meaning to do a while because, you know, we have done 68 episodes of this podcast now. I think we're on similar for Websites Decoded. And when I started these podcasts, I had absolutely no idea what even went into creating a podcast. I didn't know that you needed, you know, software to distribute it, how to even think about podcast SEO and audios and intros and transitions and, you know, like advertisements within the podcast. I didn't know any of that, and it's kind of been a journey along the way. And if I can share some of those insights with you now, hopefully that's helpful. You know, maybe when we get to 100 episodes, that I'll just tell you that everything I told you in this episode is a complete lie, and that nothing is true. But hopefully, you know, these learnings will see us through into the next kind of phase of this podcast growth. I think there's definitely some learnings in there, like the YouTube first strategy, which, you know, if you're thinking about podcasting now, is definitely one that I would recommend taking into. So, yeah, well, hopefully you enjoyed this bit of a different podcast episode. If you did enjoy it, then a follow or a like on any podcast platform that you listen to would be great, or on YouTube would be even better. And yeah, apart from that, I will catch you next time. Bye, everyone.